Quicksort is a divide and conquer sorting method that uses a partition to section an array into smaller portions. This is one algorithm that can be used for the partition. First, we must choose a pivot. For this example, I'm selecting the first element in the array to be the pivot element. Our goal is to get all the elements smaller than the pivot element to the left and bigger elements to the right in relation to the pivot. There are two indices that we need to keep track of: the pivot index and the working index. Our pivot index starts at the low index, and our working index will start at 1 plus the pivot index. We also need to keep track of the pivot element, which is simply the element at the low index. The working index will increment through the entire array, and the pivot index will be incremented as needed. Now we compare our working index with our pivot element. If the element at the working index is less than the pivot element, then we increment the pivot index and swap the values at the working index and the pivot index. Then we increment the working index. And again, we compare the element at the working index with the pivot element. The element at the working index is not less than the pivot element, so all we'll do is increment the working index. Here, the element at the working index is less than the pivot element, so we'll increment the pivot index and swap the values at the working index and the pivot index. Then we'll increase the working index. As we continue to apply this algorithm to the rest of the array, items smaller than the pivot element will shift left, while items bigger than the pivot element shift right. The whole time, our pivot element stays at the beginning of the array. Once the working index has incremented through the entire array, we need to swap the element at the low index with the element at the pivot index. Now the pivot index is properly sorted, and all the elements to the left are less than, while all the elements to the right are greater than.